I want to talk about the issue of biblical atonement versus this notion of forgiveness by fiat. That's what I like to call it. Atonement versus forgiveness by fiat. And so, I referenced in a previous video, why can't somebody just say it's okay? you know, um, if there's a powerful enough person, he could just declare that, you're off the hook, it's okay. And then you're just forgiven and then everything is okay, right? And why can't you do that? That in the Bible is impossible. It cannot be done this way. And what I want to do is I want to give you some discussion about why there must be some accomplishment that pays, that answers for sin. That's what atonement is. Something is actually done and it's accomplished, which now pays for this violation, for this disruption, this corruption, this great stain and ugliness, all this great horrible power that is called sin. And that's called atonement. So first I want to give you an illustration that I actually heard. I think it's Pastor Timothy Keller. And I heard this in a sermon. I can't remember exactly. So just but it goes something like this, right? And he was trying to explain why you can't just say it's okay, or that God just says, your sin, well, it's okay. Why he can't just do that, what I'm calling forgiveness by fiat. So he gives this illustration. Let's say your friend comes over to your house, right? Somebody you love, you care about, you're really glad to have them come over to your house. So they come inside, and then while they're visiting over, they knock over a lamp, and this lamp, is shattered and it's broken and it's no good. And so they go, oh no, they feel terrible. They're like, oh no, I broke your lamp. And so they immediately pull out their wallet, or say, actually, I'll just go to the store and I'll get you another one. And you, because you love this person and you don't want them to feel bad, you say, no, it's okay. It's okay. Isn't that forgiveness by fiat? It's a kind of forgiveness. They did something kind of like that harmed you. And, maybe it's not the biggest, most greatest violation in the world. Obviously, it's relatively minor in the grand scheme of things, but they harmed you. And we can call it a sin of sorts. And you just say, it's okay. It isn't that forgiveness by fiat. And what Pastor Keller says is, no, that's not. Because the way to make this right again, is there's always a cost. Something has to be done, accomplished to fix this, to atone for this, to atone for this disruption. And so either they pay the money, that's why they pull out their wallet, or they go to the store and replace the lamp for you. Get at least as good as one. If they got you a junky one, then that's kind of like, that doesn't really, that isn't really atoning for the problem, right? It doesn't truly solve the problem. It like leaves you with like, what is this? They have to give you one that's at least as good, if not better. But since you care about this person, you say it's okay. You forgive them this violation. You've forgiven them their debt, what they owe you. And so you know what that means? So now it costs you. That's what it means. So then, they say, oh, they feel bad. No, I assure you it's okay. So they go home and you have a couple choices now. So that room where that lamp was, that room is just dark now. So every time you go into that room, you're like, oh, don't have that lamp anymore. So I guess I just have to deal with it being dark. That's the cost. You don't want your friend to be imposed on that debt and that cost. So you took that cost. Forgiveness cost you delight, or you have to go to the store and pay for it. So it costs you your money. So this is just it's a really nice, and it just helps give you a real world example of how even at something like a lamp, that there's a debt, there is a cost, something must be done. Now just imagine how much more if the violation is much more serious and much more real, right? Now that's one reason I want to give you, and that's a good one, but I want to give you something even deeper than that. And that is a theological reason, which comes to the very nature of God himself. And I taught you in an earlier video, that the divine essence, that which is essential to the divinity of God, is that the theologians figured this out on the basis of attributes. And if there are certain attributes apart from which, if you get rid of this attribute, God just stops being God. His very divinity is somehow broken. Then that's part of the divine essence. And so everybody knows that God must be powerful, Not every single religious worldview believes that God, their God or God is omnipotent, but certainly the Bible does, and so do some other religious views. Like Jews believe that, Muslims believe that God is omnipotent. So that's an attribute apart from which God is not God. So it's an essential attribute. It's part of His essence. Okay, that's as Christians would say, and they would probably say the same. But the Bible also teaches part of the divine essence is that God is infinitely loving, and He is also infinitely just. I said this to you before, and in some sense, I'm simplifying something, but this really gets at the core issue. So if God is omnipotent, almighty, and infinitely and perfectly loving, and infinitely and perfectly just, but then there's a being that comes along that He loves, but then sins against Him, violates holiness, and violates the relationship and rebels against the relationship. And since God is infinitely glorious, it's a horrible piece of violence and vandalism against that which is glorious. And it incurs tremendous. In order to fix this, can God simply just say it's okay? And here, I had you do this reading, and in the readings, I said to you there's a difference in the monotheistic doctrines. That there's this doctrine that goes back to a medieval theologian called Scotus. There's a Scotistic doctrine of God, and then there's more of a biblical vision of God, which most people tend to attribute to like Augustine, at least in the West we do. But this is the one that's more in line with the Bible. But I'm using this term Scotus, and here is the way I'll describe it, which is that really that God's omnipotence is really the core doctrine that makes God God. And that defines all other things, so that what is deemed right and righteous and holy, God can even change that. That isn't like an eternal attribute that's just completely fixed for all eternity, because God is perfectly righteous, and it can't change because He's always perfectly righteous. But now He can actually, because His omnipotence can override whatever His perfect justice and righteousness is, He can reshape that and define that. And so that's what Scotus taught. And actually, there's a modern expression of that doctrine of God, and that's in Islam. Islam believes that that God's, since He is so utterly almighty, the most important thing is that we submit to His will. And if God changes His mind on us, we can't question it. He can, and He's not bound. I talked about this in a previous video where I talked about how God is a covenantal God, and that Muslims, those who believe in Islam, it's offensive to them that God can be bound by a covenantal promise, that He then He condescends to lower Himself to actually be bound to this these small little these human beings that He made. That Muslims do not believe in that, and they don't. But this is also another place where Islamic doctrine of God disagrees with the biblical doctrine of God, and that is that His almightiness can't in the biblical in the Islamic doctrine, they do probably believe that if God just says, I just forgive you because He's almighty and He's and we can submit, nobody else can say anything. So I say, well, He can just say, this person I forgive, I receive you into my paradise. This person I don't. Right? And maybe this person was similarly righteous, but God could still do that anyway, because God, his greatness is primarily about His power and His almighty and His omnipotence. That's the Islamic doctrine, but it isn't the Bible's doctrine. And in the Bible's doctrine, as I've said to you before, God, if we violate sin, it leads to actually a dilemma in the very nature of the essence of God Himself. Actually, the very nature of the divine nature is under threat. That if He fails righteousness and justice, He actually fails His divinity. And that's such a radically and unbelievable notion. It's actually pretty offensive to Muslims to even consider that possibility, but this is what the Bible teaches. So that if human beings fail through sin, which we certainly do, God cannot simply just use His omnipotence and say, oh, I just let it go. Why? Because then that would be a violation against justice and righteousness. And justice and righteousness is not something outside of God. Like there's a series of rules outside of God, and we broke that rule, and God says, well, I'm the omnipotent being, and those rules, I can change those rules. I'll just change. That's really more like the Scotus doctrine of God or the Islamic doctrine of God. No, righteousness and justice is his very character. It's his very being. That's an attribute. It's a divine attribute that can never be violated. And if it's violated, that if he violates it, he fails his divinity. If somebody else violates it, they must incur justice, which means they must pay for it. So if sin is to be answered for, atoned for, there has to be a cost, see? And since our sin against God is so tremendous and so great, the answer, the cost for that is so tremendous and so great. The Bible calls that atonement. And the Bible offers, thankfully, there is a pathway that atonement can actually be accomplished and our sin can be paid for. So like these are different words we use. We pay for this, the sin is paid for, or that we are cleansed, we are washed. It's a horrible sin that it must be washed. We are made holy when we were unrighteous, we were unclean, we were made clean, or that there's payment, or there's debt, that's another term, or there's a ransom. Again, that's also debt language, that there's a payment, that we are now under enslavement or away from God, but for God, he has to pay a ransom, he has to pay in order to then receive him to back. And what is this? It's that the sin must be paid for. And it's an absolute must. It's an absolute must from the divine nature, from his very attributes. So in this, any kind of teaching that we can be saved without atonement, without an accomplishment of atonement, then that's not biblical teaching of salvation. It's not the true God. Soon as you hear that type of teaching, there's some kind of fissure or break. You're not even talking about the same God. And that if God can just accept you, on the basis of your works, that is absolutely not the same God, because our works isn't good enough to atone and answer and make payment and what was right for our wickedness and for our unrighteousness. And so there must be a great payment, and thankfully there is a way, and God made that way through a sacrifice, and then that he chose himself, the Son of God himself came to be that sacrifice and make atonement for us. This is the gospel. Any gospel without atonement is not the true gospel. Please don't believe that, but instead be in great awe of our God to make this way and for Jesus to accomplish it for us.